Welcome to Session 6 of our study on the Book of Proverbs. In this session, we read and discuss chapters 21 through 24. We will finish up the second major collection of Proverbs, Proverbs of Solomon, and read and discuss two smaller collections, Words of the Wise, and These Also Are of the Wise. We'll begin in a minute, but first a word of prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth, and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills so we may go out to live what we've learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So we continue on with Proverbs of Solomon, a collection that began with chapter 10, goes on through chapter 22, the 16th verse. We'll continue to see a variety of proverbs in this collection, some still the antithetical style, but also some better than proverbs, or some that just explain how life works. We'll also look at a couple of shorter collections in this session, one which appears to have been adapted from an ancient Egyptian set of wisdom instructions. Chapter 21 again offers assorted proverbs on various subjects. We will hear about the heart or mind, some about justice, and more instruction. About a third of this chapter is made up of antithetical proverbs. Let's look at the opening frame, the first three verses. These three verses all refer to the Lord. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. All deeds are right in the sight of the doer, but the Lord weighs the heart. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Verse 1 plays on the idea that there are deep waters in a man's heart. If we look at it as a riddle, we could say, what could it mean that a king's heart is streams of water in God's hand? It would mean that God, like an engineer, can divert the channels into whatever course he chooses. Verse 2 is linked to verse 1 with the word heart, or in some translations, mind. It underscores God's authority over everyone, including the king. All deeds are right in the sight of the doer, but the Lord weighs the heart. Verse 3 states God's preference for justice over sacrifice, a sentiment that is commonly found in the writings of the latter prophets. Here the proverb does not reject sacrifice altogether. Sacrifice just has a relatively lower priority for the Lord. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Verse 5. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to want. The contrast is between the person who carefully plans his projects and carries them out assiduously, and those who do things without much deliberation at all. The consequences for this are purely pragmatic. The diligent reap a profit, and the rash end up penniless. So let's go down to verse 9. It is better to live in a corner of the housetop than in a house shared with a contentious wife. This, again, is a better than proverb. We put this poor guy up on a roof, back in a corner, exposed to the elements. What could be worse than having to live in a corner of a roof? Well, having to live in a nice house with a quarrelsome wife. Verse 11. When a scoffer is punished, the simple become wiser. When the wise are instructed, they increase in knowledge. So when the fool sees that a troublemaker has come to grief by being punished, he wises up. He needs someone else to set the example for him. On the other hand, the wise man needs only instruction to get wisdom. Let's look at verse 16. Whoever wanders from the way of understanding will rest in the assembly of the dead. Whoa. Robert Alter's translation is, a man who strays from insight's ways will repose in the assembly of shades. A person who strays from the straight way of wisdom will find himself in the realm of the nether world. There are grave consequences for getting off track. Verse 18. The wicked is a ransom for the righteous, and the faithless for the upright. Here the idea is that whatever disasters might have happened to the good person will fall instead on the wicked. Verse 19 sounds something like verse 9. It is better to live in a desert land than with a contentious and fretful wife. The difference is that verse 9, the man lived in a corner on the rooftop. Here in verse 19, he lives in the desert. Same idea though. Verse 28, a false witness will perish, but a good listener will testify successfully. The implication here is that the liar does not have the last word. Those who listen speak credibly and convincingly. Verse 31, now this is the closing frame where we're back to the Lord again. Remember the first three verses included the Lord. We have the Lord again in verse 31. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord. So we see the horse is ready for battle here. It's either saddled for the rider or hitched to the chariot. So we may expect that this preparation will lead on to success. But surprise, the outcome of the battle is determined by God alone. So we go on to chapter 22. The first 16 verses of this chapter close out this collection of Proverbs, the Proverbs of Solomon. Again, these verses provide a mix of themes, literary forms similar to what we have seen in the past few chapters. The prevalent topic here is wealth and poverty in this chapter. Verse 1, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. A more literal translation would say something like, a name is choicer than great wealth, than silver and gold, good favor. The NRSV added the word good in front of name, which seems to be implied by the context. Wealth, silver, and gold are more fleeting in life than a good name or good favor. Verse 2 says, the rich and the poor have this in common. The Lord is the maker of them all. Again, a more literal translation would say, the rich and poor come together. The Lord is the maker of both. Verse 7, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender. So despite common humanity of the rich and poor, the writers recognize that economic disparities fuel disparities in power and social position. The parallelism of the two-line verse equates the borrowers with the poor. Verse 8 is a caution against the abuse of power. Whoever sows injustice will reap calamity, and the rod of anger will fail. Verse 13 sounds interesting. The lazy person says, there's a lion outside. I shall be killed in the streets. So here we have a lazy man giving free rein to his fantasy in order to find excuses for not leaving his house. He imagines a lion prowling the streets will viciously murder him as though it were a malicious assassin. Finally, in this collection, verse 16, oppressing the poor in order to enrich oneself and giving to the rich will lead only to loss. So this is another proverb that is not a didactic maxim, but rather an observation about this sometimes paradoxical nature of human reality. In some cases, a person may try to take advantage of a poor man, and yet the poor man thrives. In some cases, a person may want to give to someone who already had plenty, and somehow the rich man ends up in want. Verse 17 begins a new collection of Proverbs that has been labeled Words of the Wise. It's divided into two subunits, chapter 22, verse 17 through chapter 23, verse 11, and chapter 23, verse 12 through chapter 24, verse 22. The first subunit has been considered for nearly a century to be an adaptation of an ancient Egyptian wisdom text. In 1923, an instruction booklet was published that was written in Egypt in the late 2nd millennium BCE, that is, prior to 1000 BCE. It was called Instruction of Amenemop and was written as 30 instructions of Amenemop to his youngest son and promoted the ideal man who is self-controlled, quiet, honest, kind, and humble. Most biblical scholars today consider the section of Proverbs that we are about to look at to be an artful adaptation of Amenemop. The sages who put the words of the wise together perhaps thought of this as a honing of thought on the wisdom of the ages and the cultures that precede and surrounded them. At the same time, they reworked Amenemop by reordering the verses and replacing less familiar Egyptian elements with Hebrew analogies and adding Hebrew expressions. We will see a shift toward personal address in this subunit, and it sounds more like chapters 1 through 9 with the father addressing his son. The antithetical proverbs almost disappear here. We will see some three-line proverbs. There will be rhetorical questions and conditional statements. Let's begin with verse 17. The words of the wise. Incline your ear and hear my words, and apply your mind to my teaching. In all likelihood, the Egyptian text was first translated into Aramaic, perhaps in the 7th century BCE. At that time, Aramaic was a common language spoken all over the Near East. Diplomats and scholars in Israel certainly knew Aramaic, and so an adaptation from Aramaic to Hebrew would have been perfectly reasonable. The Hebrew of this section incorporates a number of Aramaic usages. The opening lines of the first chapter of the Egyptian set of instructions, Emin and Mop, read like this. Give your ears, hear the sayings, give your heart to understand them. It profits to put them in your heart. Woe to him who neglects them. Let him rest in the casket of your belly. May they be bolted in your heart. So the casket in your belly language here used sounds a little strange, but the general gist of the message sounds much more like what we heard in the early on in the book of Proverbs. Back to chapter 22, the book of Proverbs. Let's take a look at verses 18 through 21. For it will be pleasant if you keep them within you, if all of them are ready on your lips, so that your trust may be in the Lord. I have made them known to you today, yes, to you. Have I not written for you 30 sayings of admonition and knowledge, to show you what is right and true, so that you may give a true answer to those who sent you? We see these verses can easily be strung together to create a single train of thought, unlike the one verse, two-line proverbs that we've been reading the past few weeks. Verses 22 and 23 again appear to form a set. Do not rob the poor because they are poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate. For the Lord pleads their cause and despoils of life those who despoil them. The gate referred to in 22 was where the courts of justice were held, at the gates of the city. Verses 24 and 25. Make no friends with those given to anger, and do not associate with hotheads, lest you learn their ways and entangle yourself in a snare. Again, those two verses go together. Verses 26 and 27. Do not be one of those who give pledges, who become surety for debts. If you have nothing with which to pay, why should your bed be taken from under you? We read earlier about not becoming a surety for another's debts. 28 and 29. Do not remove the ancient landmark that your ancestors set up. Do you see those who are skillful in their work? They will serve kings. They will not serve common people. Verse 28 is concerned about moving a boundary marker. Real property should be inalienable. And we've read that before. Verse 29 here seems to be unrelated totally to 28. It tells us that those who are skilled at what they do will end up in the presence of kings, like Moses ended up before Pharaoh. Their skills will be acknowledged at the highest levels. We go on to chapter 23. The first three verses make up a unit. When you sit down to eat with an official, observe carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you have a big appetite. Do not desire an official's delicacies, for they are deceptive food. The second verse, and put a knife to your throat if you have a big appetite, simply means don't gorge yourself. Put a knife to your throat to keep you from eating too much. Verses 4 and 5, do not wear yourself out to get rich. Be wise enough to desist. When your eyes light upon it, it is gone, for suddenly it takes wings to itself, flying like an eagle toward heaven. So don't work too hard at getting rich, because it's just money. It's going to go away eventually. Verses 6 through 8. Do not eat the bread of the stingy. Do not desire their delicacies. For like a hair in the throat, so are they. Eat and drink, they say to you, but they do not mean it. You will vomit up a little you have eaten, and you will waste your pleasant words. The stingy host like the ruler, may make a gesture of hospitality, but what he has in mind may be anything but generous. The vivid image of vomiting in verse 8 suggests that he will offer his guests questionable food, say 3-day-old fish that has begun to go bad and that he got for a very cheap price. 9 through 11. Do not speak in the hearing of a fool, who will only despise the wisdom of your words. Do not remove an ancient landmark or encroach on the fields of orphans, for their vindicator is strong. He will plead their case against you. In verse 10, we hear again about not removing a boundary stone. This is similar to verse 28 in chapter 21 that we just read a little while ago. But here we see an admonition against entering the fields of orphans. Redeemer or vindicator may be God, but it may refer to a human vindicator as well. There will be a vindicator. This is where we end the first subunit of the words of the wise, the sayings tied to Amenhotep's instructions. In verse 12 is a renewed call for a receptive heart and ear, which indicates the beginning of the second subunit. So, verse 12, apply your mind to instruction and your ear to words of knowledge. That starts the new section. We go on. Do not withhold discipline from your children. If you beat them with a rod, they will not die. If you beat them with a rod, you will save their lives from Sheol. We see here how we still have two verses closely tied together in much of this section. So we go on. My child, if your heart is wise, my heart will also be glad. My soul will rejoice when your lips speak what is right. Do not let your heart envy sinners, but always continue in the fear of the Lord. Surely there is a future, and your hope will not be cut off. Fear of the Lord in verse 17 allows for hope, for a good future or a good end in verse 18. Verse 19 and 21. Hear, my child, and be wise, and direct your mind in the way. Do not be among wine-bibbers or among the gluttonous eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe them with rags. Verses 22 through 25 gives a string of proverbs that continue to appeal to parental joy as motivation for the youth to embrace wisdom. Listen to your father who begot you, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Buy truth and do not sell it. Buy wisdom, instruction, and understanding. The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice. He who fathers a wise son will be glad in him. Let your father and mother be glad. Let her who bore you rejoice. The next few verses go back to the stranger woman. Remember the stranger woman from chapter 6, 7? My child, give me your heart, and let your eyes observe my ways, for a prostitute is a deep pit, an adulteress in a narrow well. She lies in wait like a robber and increases the number of the faithless. So from the stranger woman we go to another potential trap, wine. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who linger late over wine, those who keep trying mixed wines. We start by asking questions, and then we get the answer. Do not look at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup and goes down smoothly. At the last, it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. Your eyes will see strange things, and your mind utter perverse things. You will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, like one who lies on top of a mast. They struck me, you will say, but I was not hurt. They beat me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake? I will seek another drink. The drinker is too stupefied by alcohol to realize he has been beaten. These words go back to verse 29. Who has wounds without cause? Well, the drinker. He's been beaten, right? At the very end of this satire, the alcoholic remains true to his addiction. Still in the half stupor as he pronounces these words, he is in no condition to go out and get more wine. But as soon as his mind clears a bit, that is exactly what he intends to do. We go on to chapter 24. We'll continue with the second subunit of words of the wise. Verses 1 and 2 again deal with the wicked urging Perseverance in the ways of wisdom, particularly when those of the wicked appear more prosperous. Do not envy the wicked, nor desire to be with them, for their minds devise violence, and their lips talk of mischief. The next few verses extol wisdom. Indefinite nouns and passive verbs appear in verses 3 and 4. A house is built, it is established, rooms are filled. Also in verse 4, we notice that there is no parallel structure between the first and second lines. By wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. See, no parallelism in this verse. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Wise warriors are mightier than strong ones, and those who have knowledge than those who have strength. For by wise guidance you can wage your war, and in abundance of counselors there is victory. Wisdom is too high for fools. In the gate they do not open their mouths. Verse 7 talks about fools will not open their mouths in the gate, that is to say, in the courts which were held at the gates of the town. Lacking all wisdom, the fools will have no idea what to say. Verses 8 and 9 form a pair again. Whoever plans to do evil will be called a mischief maker. The devising of folly is sin, and the scoffer is an abomination to all. Verses 10 through 12. If you faint in the day of adversity, your strength being small, if you hold back from rescuing those taken away to death, those who go staggering to the slaughter, if you say, look, we did not know this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who keeps watch over your soul know it? And will he not repay all according to their deeds? People are about to be slaughtered. Don't pretend you had no idea it was happening. What's your responsibility here? God knows. 13. My child, eat honey, for it is good, and the drippings of the honeycomb are sweet to your taste. Know that wisdom is such to your soul. If you find it, you will find a future, and your hope will not be cut off. In verse 13, honey is a metaphor for wisdom. It is good, sweet, it will give you a future, as in verse 14. Verse 15 and 16. Do not lie in wait like an outlaw against the home of the righteous. Do no violence to the place where the righteous live. For though they fall 7 times, they will rise again, but the wicked are overthrown by calamity. So we go on. Do not rejoice when your enemies fall, and do not let your heart be glad when they stumble, lest the Lord see it and be displeased and turn away his anger from them. Some biblical texts may seem to encourage enjoyment of another's suffering. This proverb condemns it. 19 and 20. Do not fret because of evildoers. Do not envy the wicked, for the evil has no future. The lamp of the wicked will go out. If it seems to sound familiar, we heard do not envy the wicked back in verse 1 of this same chapter. 21 and 22. My child, fear the Lord and the king, and do not disobey either of them, for disaster comes from them suddenly, and who knows the ruin that both can bring. Alters translates verse 21 as, fear the Lord, my son, and the king, neither one nor the other vex. But the NIV, the New International Version, translates this verse as, fear the Lord and the king, my son, and do not join with rebellious officials. Do not join with rebellious officials. Why is the second line in the NIV so much different? So a short digression here. The NIV and many other translations followed the Masoretic text for this verse. The Masoretic text, literally translated, says, and don't mix in tit avaya with shonim. So don't mix in or don't join in with shonim. But the meaning of shonim here is in doubt. Some think it means dissidents. The King James Version guesses them that are given to change. The verbal root of this Hebrew verb can mean to repeat or to be different, but there is no clear evidence that either of these is how it was actually used anywhere in the Bible. The Masoretic text is the Hebrew text of the Jewish Bible that was assembled and codified between the 6th and 10th century CE to reproduce as far as possible the original text of the Hebrew Old Testament. The group of scholars, several generations of scholars in fact, worked on this project for over 400 years. To do this, these scholars gathered Old Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts and whatever oral traditions that were available to them. The original Hebrew had no vowels, so they added vowels, and they came up with an official or codified version of the Hebrew Bible. The point being here that when modern scholars create translations of the Old Testament, they don't go back to the original scrolls written by Jeremiah or Moses or whoever. Those don't exist. Most translations from the Hebrew Old Testament come from these texts produced in the second half of the first millennium CE. A secondary source for today's scholars is the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that was completed in the late 2nd century BCE. It's quite common for modern translators to go to the Septuagint when they have difficulty making sense of the Masoretic text. In this case, the Septuagint uses Shenahem, meaning the two of them, instead of Shonim, and Titavar, having to do with anger instead of Titava, meaning to mix in. In this case, the scholars that produced the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV, used the Septuagint to translate verse 21, and so did Robert Alter. So we have the NIV version, the New International Version, that says, "Fear the Lord and the King, my son, and do not join with rebellious officials." And then New Revised Standard Version says, "My child, fear the Lord and King, and do not disobey either of them." So one reason that one translation sounds quite different from another one may be that the translators used different source material. That's quite common. Verse 23 begins a new collection of Proverbs. This one is labeled, "These also are the wise of the wise." There are only 12 verses in this collection. At some point, this set of verses may have circulated as an independent unit. In the Septuagint, these verses are placed after the first 14 verses of chapter 30. So the NRSV is mostly following the Masoretic text, at least in the structure of the chapters here. Verse 23 through 26. These also are sayings of the wise. Partiality in judging is not good. Whoever says to the wicked, "You are innocent," will be cursed by peoples, abhorred by nations. But those who rebuke the wicked will have delight, and a good blessing will come upon them. One who gives an honest answer gives a kiss on the lips. Verse 26 is the only explicit reference to kissing lips in the Old Testament. It is a gesture that signals mutual devotion, respect, and loyalty. However harsh the answer, if it is honest, it is to be commended. Therefore, a kiss on the lips. Verse 27, prepare your work outside, get everything ready for you in the field, and after that, build your house. This is purely pragmatic wisdom. A person must shore up his substance by working in the field, and then he will be in a position to build his house. Verses 28 and 29. Do not be a witness against your neighbor without cause, and do not deceive with your lips, and do not say, "I will do to others as they have done to me. I will pay them back for what they have done." These proverbs condemn false witnesses and tell us not to retaliate against others. Retribution is God's job. Finally, verses 30 through 34. I passed by the field of one who is lazy, by the vineyard of a stupid person, and see, it was all overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. Then I saw and considered it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed warrior. This is a miniature first-person narrative that is pretty rare in this part of the book. The author learned a lesson by observing the habits of others. So here we close out chapter 24 in the collection of These Are the Further Sayings of the Wise. We begin a new collection in our next session. These are also the Proverbs of Solomon, which the officials of King Hezekiah of Judah transcribed. So we'll read chapter 25 through 28 next session. We will also see some more Solomon Proverbs next time. Hezekiah was a king of Judah from 715 to 687 BCE. So that at least gives us a time frame for this set of Proverbs. They must have been collected sometime after Hezekiah became king. Hope to see you Sunday for our discussion. Meanwhile, have a good week.